Hello and welcome to Virtues of Peace. My name is Hope Elizabeth May, and I'm joined by Michael Buzzy, Randy Olson, Sandra Weber, who's joining us from New York, who is the author of the book, The Woman Suffrage Statue. Sandra has been on our show 2 times prior, and she's with us today. I'm so excited to have both Sandra and Caroline Sparks, who joins us from the DC area, on this show, where once again we are talking about this statue created by Adelaide Johnson, the portrait monument, also sometimes called the suffrage statue. We just had a conversation about that before we started recording, but maybe that will come up in this show. But welcome, Caroline, to Virtues of Peace.
Thank you very much.
So we do have, as I mentioned, 2 other shows on this statue, and it's so much more than a statue. We call this statue an information delivery device because there are so many stories connected to this statue, the story of how it's made, the story of what happens after it is unveiled on Susan B. Anthony's birthday, February 15th, 1921. That was Susan B. Anthony's 101st birthday. And as we've mentioned on this show before, this statue, after it's unveiled in the Rotunda of the US Capitol, which has been very much in the news these days, it is lowered to what is called the Crypt of the United States Capitol. And it stays in the crypt, really hidden in basically the basement until 1997. So this is some 76 years this statue is in the basement. And it's really Caroline Sparks, and we're going to talk about this today, who initiates. And by the way, that verb initiates is found on the inscription that was covered up on the statue. But Caroline Sparks initiates a movement of her own to raise the statue from the crypt back to the rotunda where it was meant to be. And this is just an incredible story, and we're so honored to have you here, Caroline, and as well as Sandra Weber to talk about this important history as we come to the end of Women's History Month in 2021. And so, Caroline, we're going to just start with how you became interested in women's history, women's issues, et cetera, because as Sandra and I have talked about, we, and this is a phrase I learned from Rosie Rios, are accidental feminists. That is, we didn't sort of set out to study women's history. We sort of stumbled upon it incidentally. But Carolina, as we'll talk about, you were in Washington, D.C. in 1978. We'll get to that moment eventually, but you were there for a march, a march of the Equal Rights Amendment. So, and this leads you to the statue, as we'll discuss, but obviously you were already interested in women's history, women's issues. And can you talk about how you became interested in women's history, women's issues, just originally?
Well, I my undergraduate degree is from Auburn University, and we had some wonderful history professors, and so I studied history. My field was not American history. My field at that time was European history. But I was in the first class at Auburn the year after George Wallace made his stand in the schoolhouse door at University of Alabama, and Auburn was next. And when I arrived back to school, the campus was cordoned off with all kinds of yellow tape. There were police everywhere. And this one man who was Black was going to integrate Auburn. And he was given, imagine how frightening, he was given an entire hallway of rooms with nobody to guard him but white Alabama guardsmen, who often, I mean, they did a nice job, I think, but imagine how scary that would be for someone. And my Russian history class, peculiarly, was chosen as the only class that would let the press in. And we felt somewhat foolish. He arrived in a three-piece suit with an umbrella and a black case. And we were all dressed in our little rah-rah outfits with pleated skirts and tennis shoes with socks. And I recently saw one of the Auburn newspapers from those days, and it featured a story about him. And so I finally learned his name years later. It was just this last year, and who he was. And I'm in the picture. So um, I was, I think, a sophomore at the time. And so the whole civil rights movement hit Alabama hard. I was there for when Martin Luther King was in the Birmingham jail. I was there when the church was bombed. And I became an activist about civil rights and equal rights at the time. So I didn't start out with women's rights. I started out paying attention to what was going on. And I graduated the week that Viola Liuzzo was shot on the road to Selma, 1965, because she was a white woman who had two young Black men in the car with her headed toward the Selma March. And that really started me off on a more activist course. I think it made activists of a lot of my generation. And I left the South about a year and a half later to start a history, a master's degree in history at Tulane, and focused to some extent on the suffrage movement in Great Britain, just as part of general history. But by the time I had been in the civil rights movement for a while, I moved to Seattle, as far away as I could get from Alabama at that time, and was active in civil rights and the anti-war movement, Vietnam War movement. And women were treated badly, frankly, and by the men in the movement. And so by the time I hit graduate school, I had switched to psychology at the University of Washington. And I entered graduate school for my doctorate at Ohio State in 1970 and was ready for the women's movement. By that time, I realized it was not just a racial issue, but it was also a women's issue, and became active in feminist activities. And in 1971, I incorporated and started an organization called the Women's Action Collective, and worked on women's projects for some years in the 70s until I graduated. And I started, the group that I had started was called the Women's Action Collective. And that's the group that went to Washington for the Equal Rights Amendment March in the summer of 1978. And I was with them on the lawn of the White House. And a friend and I decided to search for a women's bathroom because it was summer, it was hot, you know. And so we went into the crypt of the Capitol and stumbled across this statue of, it's 8 tons of Carrara marble. And it featured 3 feminist leaders from the Seneca Falls March. And it was Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, who had, I think she did not actually attend the Seneca Falls conference where Elizabeth Cady Stanton first called for votes for women. But she and Stanton, of course, she became the activist who traveled while Stanton stayed at home, raising her family and writing feminist materials, and writing a lot of the materials that Susan B. Anthony took with her on her tours through the states. And so at that point, we became fascinated with the whole thing. But when Ami, so my friend was Israeli, she's Bat Ami Bar-On. She just died this year around Thanksgiving, so we miss her terribly. And Ami and I went looking for the women's bathroom, and were dumbfounded when we first saw the statue. We just stopped dead in our tracks and said, why haven't we seen this before? Why do we know nothing about this? And I said to her, this statue must be moved. This statue needs to be moved to the Rotunda, because there were no women in the Rotunda. And so that started, I already knew that when I graduated, I wanted to move to Washington, partly because of Washington, D.C., partly because of all the history here. And my interest in history never waned, even though at that point I was getting a doctorate in psychology.
Mm.
So that's how it began. And I said, this needs to be moved. And at that point, I knew that I wanted to live in Washington and that I would start trying to move the statue.
This an amazing story, and so we're at the point where you do, yeah, find the statue. But I want to go back to, the story of how you became an activist and interested in women's issues, which really emerged out of what was happening with the civil rights movement. And I think that's so amazing because that is how these women who are memorialized in the statue, that is how they came to work for suffrage. That is, they were originally working on the abolition movement, and then they realized that, quote, they needed their own movement. And so there's this really important linkage. It's one of the
Yeah.
reasons why the statue is so important, because a lot of people don't understand the roots, how the suffrage movement is really rooted in the abolition movement. And I know that, Sandra, you have probably some things to say about that as well, given where you live in Inez, Mulholland, and so forth. And I just wondered, Sandra, if you could add a few tidbits about how these linkages exist between, the abolition movement and the suffrage movement, especially as regards the work of the Mulholland family.
Well, yeah, the Mulholland family is kind of the middle movement in this, right? So the early suffragists, Anthony and Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were abolitionists, right? And their voices weren't being heard, so they realized they needed to start, female anti-slavery organizations and such. And I was just so enthralled to hear Caroline talk because I've read about the women who came out of the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement and realized that their voices were not being allowed to be out front, and to hear Caroline's actual story of living it was just fantastic for me. But in between there, in the, let's say, around the 1910s, 1920s, is when we have Inez Milholland and Alice Paul, right, and the Women's Party forming, and this kind of a new kind of woman, right, coming out, and she's more out in public, and she's more athletic, and she's not afraid to speak out. And Inez's father is one of the founders of the NAACP, right, in the same time period. So her father, John Mulholland, and Inez Mulholland, and the whole family is very involved with the civil rights, with the NAACP movement at the time, and also in suffrage, the suffrage movement at that time. And it's been interesting as I've studied my local area up here in the Adirondacks, very far removed from where, let's say, the excitement's going on, but yet a lot of the main players come up here in the summertime. And so in the summertime, you had this whole mixture of people who were very active in both the civil rights movement and the suffrage movement, and it's the same people. It's so interesting how the two overlap so much.
Mm.
uh,
And wasn't one of their houses a part of the Underground Railroad?
well, it's always difficult to prove whether something is or is not, but there is one of the buildings of the Milholland estate that is said to have been part of the Underground Railroad, going through Lewis.
Yeah. So again, this statue, not only the stories of the women who were in the statue, but also Caroline and Sandra also helped to push forward this story about these linkages. I want to open it up to any other co-host to see if they have a follow-up from Caroline's story. Go ahead, Randy.
Yeah, I mean, it's just from what I'm gathering, is this you had this progression where more and more of your eyes were opened, I guess, like the scales were dropped from your eyes, so to speak, like more and more, and the role and importance of assimilating the story into your life. It seemed to kind of grow and progress over time, and um, I'm wondering, like, was there a specific thing? You presented several, obviously, but I'm wondering if there was one standout moment that went from I need to concentrate on like I need to concentrate on this in my life and make it my story and become part of the story individually, because I'm really kind of obsessed with this power of the individual. And so I'm curious, like, was there an individual moment, or has it, generally speaking, been a
Y-
group thing in your case?
Two things stand out to me. The fact that I was graduating from college the week as a historian, I mean, with a BA in history, the same week that Alabama was so violent with the Selma March, and the murder of Viola Liuzzo was shocking enough to wake me up further. And we had been following all of this through my years at undergraduate school at Auburn. And so I was really kind of appalled at what was going on in my home state. But even moving as far away as Seattle didn't help that much because of the behavior of men in the civil rights movement. And I remember one young man who kept calling me a petty bourgeois, and things like this. And I thought, you don't know me, you don't know what's happening. Yes, I was raised in the South in a middle class family, but it was like a slur, and this was not the only thing that went on with women. Um, in that time, the late 60s. And so I became more and more inflamed about our behaviors toward me and other women, that, as I said, um, by the time I hit Ohio State, I was ready to deal with women's issues, and to work toward not being treated that way. The second wave of the women's movement, which is what I consider the late 60s and early 70s, we really still had very little voice. And so I added my voice to that movement and figured we could get more done that way. And so that's been a passionate part of my life for many years.
Thank you. That colors it in a little for me. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anybody else? Go ahead, Michael.
Yes. Thank you. I had a follow-up question for you as well, Caroline. What would you say would be your primary motivation for leaving Alabama? Was it this desire to get away? Was it a desire to escape the violence? Did you think you'd be able to? Was it the desire to seek a possible outside perspective from what you were experiencing in Alabama to sort of come to understand this movement in a more broad sense, the civil rights movement, and then obviously then your eventual head towards the women's movement?
I left Alabama for a whole number of reasons. And by that time, I had my master's in history from Tulane. And I had studied other cultures. I had studied revolutions everywhere in Europe. And I was more in economic history than, certainly not women's history at that time. But I enjoyed looking at social movements. I had read a lot about social movements, and some about the British movement and what had happened to women trying to get the vote in Great Britain. But I have always loved looking at how people managed to change their circumstances and what it took for people to stand up and fight for their rights. And a lot of that happened, of course, in Great Britain as the agricultural movement shifted into the factories, and at one point for my dissertation, which was on British history in the 1820s, I got interested in the social, this is one reason I switched to psychology, is that I did a whole sociogram of the British Parliament. Somewhere that may be in my basement in a box still. I was more interested in how women were, not women, mostly men at that point, were maneuvering with each other, and the agricultural class of wealthy Britons, English people, didn't work. And of course, the Industrial Revolution created people who did work for a living and who started corporations, et cetera, et cetera. And so I got interested in how they managed this transition from agriculture to industrial ways of earning money, and studied their relationships and how they married within families and outrages in families, if someone married down, into the industrial class, from landowners. And so I did a whole sociogram. And at that point, I realized that I was really studying people. I was not studying so much economic history. And so by the time I had read 10 years of the British parliamentary proceedings on microfiche, I tell my students, I ran out of the library screaming and decided to study live people instead of dead ones. And that usually gets me a laugh in class, but it really did have to do with the fact that it became very clear to me that I was more interested in how people operate than just the sheer economics of things.
Thank you.
Oh, but that doesn't really answer, I'm sorry, that doesn't answer your question. So when I got back to Alabama with my master's degree in history, I just needed to get out of the South. I mean, I was appalled at what was going on. But don't forget, I'm also named for my mother. So some of this was to get away from my mother because she identified closely with me, because her name was also Caroline and she was very demanding. And I thought, this is my way out. And so I moved as far away as I could into the West Coast. And I was out there for 2.5 years. And that was a wonderful transition because Seattle, Washington State, the sort of western part of Washington State, has always been very liberal. It was the home of a lot of the labor movements. And so Seattle, I developed a completely different perspective. And I went back to school in psychology, but I was also working as a caseworker in King County, and became a children's protective service worker. And so I was aware of the injustices. When I read case reports, it was like reading the minds of the caseworkers in earlier decades. And frankly, I thought they should all be taken out and burned and we should start over. I worked with Indian tribes a bit who were on AFDC, which was active. AFDC still existed in those years, to support women and children, and the injustices done to the Indians, whom no one really bothered much about, to understand their differences in their culture and their situations. And so it just was a wonderful education in civil rights and a wonderful education in taking the point of view of other people from other cultures. So that by the time I returned, my mother and I were on better terms. And I drove 5 days in my Volkswagen Bug with all of my belongings around me. And my mother was the one who said, call me every night so that I know you're safe. And I thought, oh, for heaven's sakes. But frankly, every night I was glad I had somebody to report to at that point, to say I'm alive and well, and report, what town I was in. And so I became a bit more mellow as time passed. I think I was 27 when I entered graduate school in 1970.
Thanks. Michael, does that solve the issue for you?
Yes, and seriously, Caroline, thank you so much for sharing. I find that background history to be utterly riveting. You know, what the motivations were, that life experience that you're able to garner from just leaving the circumstances in which you had lived all of your life and what was going on at the South at the time. No, and then even to hear about just that perceptual shift of realizing in your educational career that, no, I really want to be focused. I have this thing I really want to be focusing on, and all this that I've doing before has sort of led me in that direction. So seriously, thank you so much for sharing. I thoroughly enjoyed getting to learn about what all these motivations are. It was awesome.
Right.
Right. So I want to sort of go a little bit forward in time from graduate school and go back to when you're in Washington, D.C. and you stumble upon the portrait monument. And I just want to put this fact out there because I didn't know this, and this is one of the joys of working on this statue is that you learn so much. And you were there in 1978.
Yes, I'm very old. I'm very old now.
Well, I don't believe in age in any way. That wasn't the striking thing, but what you shared with me, and this is on our show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com, because there was some back and forth about what year this really was, but it was indeed 1978, because this was a march for the Equal Rights Amendment, which as we have said, was originally called the Lucretia Mott Amendment by the National Woman's Party, and Lucretia Mott is one of the individuals memorialized in the statue. And this, I learned from that New York Times article, this march was done on the 1-year anniversary of Alice Paul's death.
Yeah.
I just like that, just spirit of history. The spirit of history is working at this moment. Absolutely. This is just like, I just get chills thinking about it. And it's like this, the march is organized on the 1-year anniversary of her death, which I think is July 9th, 1977 is when she dies. So this is July 9th, 1978. That calls you to DC. You go there with your Women's Action Collective that you organized some years earlier. And there you are, it's just like the spirit of Alice Paul, the Equal Rights Amendment, which has everything to do with this statue. And you stumble upon the statue, as you discussed.
Right.
And can you just, like you said, like you couldn't believe it. Again, this is in the crypt.
Yes, we're just standing there in the crypt, in the middle of the crypt, staring at this thing that was against the wall and saying, wait a minute, we thought we knew a whole lot about women's history, and why has no one ever told us that this is there? It's huge. I mean, if you've been to the statue, all of you, the statue is huge and very heavy. And the sculptor, we learned later, Adelaide Johnson, had to go to Italy. Alice Paul's center, she was sent to Italy because you can't work in Carrara marble unless you're Italian. And she was there so she could see what they were doing and to sort of oversee the work, even though she couldn't work on it herself as a sculptor.
And so anybody just want to jump in with this fact that it is in fact a march for the Equal Rights Amendment, which is why Caroline is in DC, and that Equal Rights Amendment is so tied to.
We don't have it yet.
We don't have it yet. That's right. That's going to come up maybe at the end of this show, maybe another one. We still don't have it. And
one as a stunt for International Women's Day years ago in Ohio, I forget what year we did this. A friend of mine who was part of the Women's Action Collective, Jan Britton, and I, and a whole bunch of people went down to the immigration service in Ohio. And if I pull my hair back, I look like Susan B. Anthony, and Jan looks sort of like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And we had so much fun. People were crowding the hall as Jan and I tried to register to vote. And I signed up as Susan B. Anthony, and she signed up as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, because we had read that the Supreme Court ruling, and one reason we needed the ERA was because the Supreme Court decided at one point that men meant men in the Constitution, and that women, we felt that we were not full citizens. And so we registered to become full citizens of the United States. And of course, no one in the building recognized that we weren't Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And so they signed us up, you know, and we filled out a form or so. And while everybody else is outside chanting slogans, because Columbus, Ohio is the capital of Ohio, everyone else is outside chanting slogans about women's rights, while Jan and I are trying to become full citizens. And so it was a good stunt, actually. And ringing us on top of buildings and balustrades and whatever were all these people from whatever the Ohio police would be, taking pictures of all of this. And I think we must have made the local news or something that night. But it was an effort on our parts to say, look, we're not considered full citizens in the Constitution without an Equal Rights Amendment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And anyway, yeah, the Equal Rights Amendment still has not been ratified, and
No.
long story. And there was recently a program on Hulu called Mrs. America, which sadly does not go into the early years of the Equal Rights Amendment, which is really like 1921.
Yes.
Called the Lucretia Mott Amendment, but begins in 1971, if I recall, with like Gloria Steinem's campaign and so forth. And it's a good series, Mrs. America on Hulu. But anybody else on? Sandra, do you want to talk about why Caroline is there in DC, et cetera?
Well, I just wanted to again make the connection between the Equal Rights Amendment and the statue. And the statue celebration, it was unveiled on February 15th, 1921. And immediately after the celebration, the National Women's Party held their conference, in which they decided to disband because, you know, suffrage had been awarded. And then they decided to reform and still call themselves the National Women's Party. But now they had to decide what their agenda was. So it was in the day or 2 days after unveiling the statue that they decided to take up equal rights as their new agenda. And then Alice Paul went to law school for a little while, and then she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And then so you see their publication is called The Suffragist during the years where they're working on the 19th Amendment. And after that is ratified, that name is changed to Equal Rights. So
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And then about 1923, 24, for several years there, instead of calling it the Pioneer Statue, the Statue of the Pioneers, they called it the Statue of the Equal Rights Pioneers.
Mm-hmm. And it became a place where people working on the Equal Rights Amendment in the early years would go. They would go to that statue and try to get some inspiration and tap into the earlier energies. Great. And so you stumble upon the statue in 1978. Why? Because you're there for an Equal Rights Amendment march,
yes.
held on the 1-year anniversary of Alice Paul's death.
Yes.
And you stumble upon it, you're blown away. Like, why didn't I know about this? I've had this experience before, by the way, but not with it. And then you really start to focus on, like, after you move to DC, you really start to you continue that work that, building the Women's Action Collective in Ohio. You begin to organize and create educational programs in DC. And there's a number of things that you create: the Iris Glen Feminist Camp, the Feminist Walking Tour, and the Feminist Institute. And can you talk about these 3 different things? I think the Iris Glen Feminist Camp is like 1981, Feminist Walking Tour is 1982, and then the Feminist Institute 1983. So again, this first encounter with the statue 1978, and that creates, it looks to me, correct me if I'm wrong, the sort of need and the desire to create these educational programs.
Well, I came to Washington in the spring of 1981, the same week that Reagan was shot, leaving the Hilton Hotel. So that was my introduction to life at in DC. And there had been a couple of car bombings that killed one woman activist whose name right now I'm not going to be able to recall. It killed the this Chilean ambassador, I think, and his assistant, who was a woman. And so these things happened just as I arrived in Washington. But I came here knowing that one of the things I was going to do was to get the statue moved. And so the first thing I did was to start what we called Iris Glen Feminist Camp. It was I used to be a camper, and so I knew my way around camps. And I had gotten out of Alabama some summers by being camp counselor in different states, first Connecticut, then Wisconsin. And finally, my old camp, I became the vice, whatever they called it, assistant director of the camp I grew up in every summer in Alabama. And so I knew camping, and I decided to try to get a friend to help me find camps near Annapolis, because it's near the water, and I'm always interested in being near water. And so she and I hiked through several camps that she knew about. And the one that was the best was an old-fashioned camp with tents where you roll up the tent flaps in the afternoons and you let them down at night. And it has like 4 cots in it, primitive camping. And it had some units that you could set up primitive camp tents and all this. And it was owned by the Baltimore Girl Scouts. And so I drove up there and I met a woman. I arranged to meet this woman who was in charge of this camp. And they weren't using it anymore for residential camping. So my good luck was that I had made an accurate map of the camp as I hiked the site. It was 35 to 37 acres, and it had a waterfront, so it had a dock for boating. And it had latrines. There were no indoor toilets, and nothing but cold water in the showers. And so I had made an accurate map. She asked me some questions about what I knew about latrines, and fortunately I could answer all this. And so to my delight, she let me rent the camp. And the idea was to have feminist discussions at camp, and also to enjoy being around other people who loved camping and who loved boating. And so the camp dock was real popular. And we named all the units after feminists and activists. So the registration tent was the Margaret Brent Lodge, which was named for the first lawyer who was a woman in Maryland. The dining hall, of course, became Bread and Roses. The tent units that were Amazon women and wild women. And then the units that had the tents with the board floors and the cots were named, each tent was named for a feminist activist or someone like Sacagawea. I'm forgetting the name of the woman who first climbed one of the European mountains, and she was known at the top to have, she had to hike it in a skirt. And when she got to the top, I mean, she obviously had pants underneath, she threw off her skirt for women's rights, for women not to have to wear, be confined by their clothing anymore. And so all the tents were named, and I wanted to have a children's unit, and women said, absolutely not. They sent their children off to other camps so that they could come to feminist camp and just enjoy a break. And the Scout Council rented me the canoes. And we had a meeting one night where we were drinking some beer and came up with camp names. And the one that we really loved was Camp Namanazama, because if you read it backwards in front of a mirror, it read Amazon Woman. And we tried to market it around 10:30 or 11 at night by calling friends around the United States who said, back to the drawing board. It was going to have a TV on it. Anyhow, we went back to the drawing board, and because there was some movie about campfire murders or something that year. And so I sat on the dock for a while and I thought, irises are blooming in this camp. And it became known as then just plain Iris Glen Feminist Camp. And it was innocuous enough that I didn't have to spend my nights awake wondering who was going to come in and murder people. And so that worked out fairly well. But by the time camp was over every year, the last 2 or 3 nights at camp were always, no one was attacked, but men harassed us on the docks. And I used to have to call the shore patrol to come and get men to move off the dock, or just move their boats out. And I put a ban on skinny dipping until nightfall, so that we were not attracting men in boats. So camp was a success, both because we had canoes, people brought their own boats, we added sailing, we added windsurfing, and so people could do that in between going to discussions of all kinds of feminist issues. And camp worked out very well. And some people refer to it as like Brigadoon, that it arose every summer and was active. Women were free, to discuss anything they wanted to and to have fun together. And then at the end of 10 days, because it was always 2 weekends in the week in between, it would fold its tents and disappear. So they referred to it as like Brigadoon. So after I had done the first camp, I also started doing the research on something called the Feminist Walking Tour of Capitol Hill. And we launched that the following year. My friend Jacqueline Gentry, who died about 7 years ago, and I was the director of camp. She was always the associate director, another psychologist. Jackie and I did a lot of the work on the Feminist Walking Tour of Capitol Hill, and then we had several students work with us, so that we launched it before I had launched the Feminist Institute. So both camp and the Feminist Walking Tour and Intrepid Clearinghouse became projects of the Feminist Institute, which I started in June 1983. And then that became the home for the Move the Statues campaign, which we announced our intent to move the statue formally with press present at an event we did at the Stuart Mott House on Capitol Hill in July of 1985. And that we launched the official Move the Statues campaign in 1985. So it was finally moved in 97, which is why I say it took 12 years to move the statue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that timeline. So informative. And did you talk about the statue at all during the camp?
No, we talked about the statue. We schlepped hundreds of people all over Capitol Hill. Once we launched the Feminist Walking Tour of Capitol Hill, there's very little to talk about inside some of the buildings. For instance, all the buildings of the Library of Congress only had mentioned 2 women, which is almost unbelievable, because goddesses are mentioned, but they're mentioned in their statues of wisdom and Athena, everything all over. But these are goddess figures that were looked at as muse to men's creativity. The only 2 references that we found in the buildings was there's a poetry wing in the main building that has Sappho's name on the ceiling. Among the tiles that have different names of poets, Sappho is mentioned. And then the only other thing is down in the music area, because they own all kinds of musical instruments. Part of that, there's a statue of the bust, as I recall, of Grace Coolidge, who was not Calvin Coolidge's wife. She was the daughter of a wealthy businessman who donated the Stradivarius, one or more of the Stradivarius violins. And she's remembered not because she was a writer or a poet, but because she gave money through her father. to the Smithsonian, and that was it. And there is a tape of the Feminist, of me being interviewed by PBS about this, and it was a woman who was interviewing me. And when I mentioned that there are only 2 women mentioned in the entire Library of Congress, she said, that can't be true. And I said, well, call them. They have a women's studies librarian. And she called me back several days later laughing. And she said, you will not believe this. When I mentioned that there are only 2 figures you mentioned, 2 women mentioned, she said, oh no, I'm sure that we mentioned Sacagawea somewhere. And so that was it. And it may still be it. I'm not sure. I haven't been down there in quite a while. But we deserve to have more women of letters mentioned, surely by now. 30 some odd years later, that they have corrected some of that. But, you know, it would be worth your while to take another tour of the main buildings and to see if there are more statues or recognition of women of letters in the Library of Congress.
Yeah, I think this has come up on earlier shows, but earlier when you were talking about how when you first encountered the statue, you were just like, what? I mean, I've never seen this before. The time, or one of the times, but probably the main time where this happened to me was when I saw the Peace Palace for the first time, but really when I went inside. And the Peace Palace is this iconic building in The Hague, the Netherlands, that is really like the symbol of the peace through law movement. And in 2013, it turned 100 years old. And it was on that 100th anniversary that the first ever statue of a woman was placed in there. Now, as you say, like there was like, you know, female representations of the goddess peace, and there are goddesses in there, but no actual women. And so the woman to go in there was Bertha von Suttner, who I didn't know who that was. And she was the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. She's someone that we talk about on this show a lot. And I'll just leave it at that. So
yes,
that was in 2013.
The whole thing, when you look at this, I'll have to see that. I haven't been to the Netherlands. I've traveled around in Europe some, but I haven't been to the Netherlands except on an airplane, and you know, where you land at the airport and take off again. But that's worth going to see the next time I'm there. But it's incredible when you start looking at it, since women are half the population, that we are not represented even now. And don't forget, when we started the Move the Statue campaign and the 75th anniversary of Suffrage Task Force, because I figured that was the year to strive for getting it moved, there were very few women in the US Congress. So Hillary Clinton was our honorary co-chair for that. And all the women in Congress signed on. So I have a list of them, but not nearly the representation that we have now of women in the House and the Senate. I think there were still only 2 women in the Senate. But when you start looking at this and take a hard look at what's going on, this is not accidental. I mean, women just aren't there, even now. And so, or not paid attention to in the same way.
Right. And so you're talking about 1995, which is the 75th anniversary of the 19th Amendment.
Yes.
And I want to go back in time a little bit, because it's really 1985 that you said you launched. That we launched. Yes. Yeah. So that's the sort of like official, we're going to do this thing.
That's right.
Do it. 1985.
And to my delight, a friend of my sister's who was a reporter for the Birmingham News, I do have an article with a picture of me, which the picture is awful, but she announced our intent to move the statue, and it appeared in the Birmingham News.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
And so Alabama got the word.
That's amazing. So I'm going to actually in a moment play a clip of you from 1990 when you are at the crypt, the statue when it's in the crypt. And so this is, a few years later, but you also, announce your intention to move it then. But before I play that clip, I just want to see if anybody else has any follow-up questions, etc., comments as to what we've been talking about. Go ahead, Randy.
Well, I'll try to make it brief. We've mentioned the word psychology a few times, and we've been talking about the absence of like actual women being represented in these various buildings, and I just want to like play in the defense of men being a man. I just want to bring up the fact that I don't think that men actually see women when men look at women. And this idea comes up from Carl Jung and this the anima projection, right? But when men look at women, they see the ideal. They see the manifestation of the divine through that woman. That's why men get very, very nervous around beautiful women, right? They see this figure that's not just a person, it's literally like the part of nature that does a selection mechanism. And so the fact that women are personified as divine figures, I think that there's something that it might be leaning into like a benevolent sexism or something, but I think that there's something about that I at least wanted to acknowledge. Is it I don't think that enough credit gets given to that. Like the divinity of the feminine it's at least present, whether or not it's reasonable, like and actually pulled into the form of a physical woman. Like I think that that's something that needs to be addressed. But I don't know. I want to pull this other frame of reference into view.
I don't think there's something benevolent about how men see women in general, or we wouldn't have the Me Too movement. We wouldn't have the amount of rapes and assaults on women. I think it's woman as other, and that's how it's perceived. Yes, you may admire a beautiful woman, and we may admire men who are handsome and beautiful as well, but we don't play it out the way that it plays out, and it plays out across our culture. It is toxic. Women try to talk about it. We are not successful even now. After decades of my activism as a feminist, I still have to worry about my safety in a way that you do not. And so, no, I will reject your claim of benevolent ways of looking at women in this culture. And in fact, in other cultures, especially the Far East and the Middle East, women are still looked at as chattel. I don't care, beautiful or not. We are not looked at as full human beings. And until that changes, I'm sorry, I won't call it benevolent.
Fair enough.
Anybody else? I'm going to play this clip of Caroline. And Caroline is speaking in 1990 at an event in the Crypt. And you can watch the video of this on our show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com. The clip is around 5 minutes long.
At the first celebration of suffrage in the Rotunda, a large pageant had been organized by the National Women's Party. It was held on Susan B. Anthony's 100th birthday, February 15th, 1921, and representatives of 36 national women's organizations and hundreds of spectators presided over by Jane Addams gathered to present this monument to suffrage to Congress on behalf of the women of America. It was a victory celebration preceded by a lengthy processional into the Rotunda of women bearing banners of all states in the Union. Each organization placed a wreath of flowers in the suffrage colors of purple, white, and gold at the base of the statue. As the statue, veiled in yellow, was unveiled, Sarah Bard Field, a suffragist who had once driven her Ford alone all the way from California, carrying suffrage petitions from thousands of West Coast women, looked out over the assembled crowd, turned her eyes to Speaker of the House Frederick Gillette, an anti-suffragist, and said, "Mr. Speaker, I give you revolution." It had not been easy getting this statue into the Capitol. The National Women's Party, under the leadership of Alice Paul, had lengthy negotiations with the Joint Library Committee of Congress over the acceptance of the statue. As late as February the 8th, the committee was still refusing to accept it. Without securing any advance permission, the Women's Party then unloaded this 8-ton block of Carrara marble on the Capitol doorstep. And in a secret executive session of the Library Committee, Alice Paul and Anita Politzer struck a deal with the committee. Although the women originally wanted the statue to stand in the rotunda with Lincoln's statue, it was to be presented in the rotunda but then immediately removed to this basement crypt. The Library Committee then, without the women knowing it, issued an order to have the inscription, written in gold leaf by the sculptor beneath the names of the suffrage leaders, whitewashed out. When the statue was placed here in the basement, which was then a storage room, the names were turned to the wall and to this day cannot be seen. The inscription has never been replaced. The original inscription on the statue described the three suffrage leaders as the three great destiny characters of the world whose spiritual import and historical significance transcend that of all others of any country or any age. Members of the Library Committee balked at this so-called pagan language that they thought glorified the feminist movement, apparently fearing that the statue represented a trinity of goddesses. A year after the statue was removed to the basement storage area, members of the National Women's Party protested that it was covered with dirt and surrounded by rubbish. Unable to have the statue cleaned, they brought mops and buckets in and cleaned it themselves and demanded unsuccessfully that it be moved away from the wall and placed in the center of the crypt. The suffrage statue has been known by various names: the Woman Movement, Revolution, and the Pioneer Suffrage Statue. Today, right here, it is mislabeled the Suffragette Monument, even though American women rejected the use of the diminutive and referred to themselves as suffragist. We believe the inscription should be replaced, the statue should be relabeled, and its history be made available to the public in more complete form. There are six other statues of women in this building. Each state has the right to place 2 statues in the Capitol, and of 95 statues currently placed, only 6 honor women. Most of these statues have been placed in obscure locations, including the basement, down long corridors, and behind pillars. Only the statues of Frances Willard from Illinois and Esther Hobart Morris from Wyoming are in visible locations on the main floor of this building. Mother Joseph, the architect and sister of Providence who built many hospitals in the West, who was honored by the state of Washington in 1980, is at the end of the hall of columns on the basement floor behind the guard's desk. As I came into this building yesterday by that entrance, even though I visited the statue many times, I could not see it as I entered. Educator Maria Sanford's statue, presented in 1958 by the state of Minnesota, is in a section of the Senate connecting corridor currently barred to the public. Jeanette Rankin, the first woman to serve in Congress, honored by Montana in 1985, is also here in the basement. The statue of Florence Rena Sabin, the first woman to graduate from Johns Hopkins with a medical degree, who is from Representative Schrader's home state of Colorado, is behind a pillar in Statuary Hall. We want these statues moved. We are announcing today a campaign to move the women's statues. We want Florence Sabin out from behind the pillar, and I'm sure Representative Schrader joins us in that. We want Maria Sanford liberated from the closed corner, and we want the Pioneer Suffrage statue upstairs in the rotunda.
And that was from 1990, from a larger event held on Women's Equality Day, August 26th. And you can access the archive of that, our show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com. So that's 1990, and things really sort of pick up speed, it seems, in 1995, and that's because it was the 75th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And that became your target date, as you said before. And if you go onto our show resources page, there is another C-SPAN archive of you in 1995 at this 75th anniversary event. And it is at 1995 when you start to see movement in the United States Congress, and it is Senator Ted Stevens who sort of takes the lead in getting his colleagues to sign on to this resolution to move the statue. And he, thanks to him, he reads your name into the congressional record. That is, Ted Stevens reads your name into the congressional record, and you can access that on our show resources page. And can you talk about how Senator Stevens became involved?
Yes, a person who helped between the 1990 speeches at in the Crypt, who was one of our committee with the Feminist Institute to begin to move the statue, was Barbara Irvine, who lives in Alice Paul's hometown. And she got interested in the move of the statue, partly because of her admiration for Alice Paul. And Barbara and I spent time before the 1990 event schlepping around congressional offices looking for supporters. And in some ways, we felt like little old ladies in tennis shoes, even though we're much older now. Now we really are little old ladies in tennis shoes. But Barbara and I would schlep around and look for supporters. And somehow we got the name of a woman, young woman named Sherry Little, who graduated from American University in women's studies. And she was an aide to Senator Stevens. And we met her, she met with us, and she introduced us to her boss. I'm trying to remember his first name now. Maybe you have it, it's Stasser. He was the chief of staff for Senator Stevens. And we eventually met with him and with Senator Stevens. And then I realized that we did have support. And he was from Alaska. He was later almost tarred and feathered, but he was interested and disgraced in a Senate scandal that I don't believe is true, actually, but whatever. Senator Stevens was interested in moving the statue because he saw it as a tribute to his mother, who was a suffragist from the early days of the 1920s, as she was for the women's vote, etc. And he wanted to honor his mother, and which was wonderful of him. He was very generous with us, including our testimony in the congressional record. There is an error there that I now realize why that error happened. I said that we had the ERA march in 1977. That wasn't true. It was 1 year after Alice Paul's death was in 1977. So the ERA march was in the summer of 1978. Now I get the connection again. But he was very generous to us. And so Sherry began to work with us to be sure that Congress had the word on the statue. Unfortunately, in the House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich was the House Speaker at the time. And I actually realized that I had gone to school with Newt Gingrich at Tulane. He was in American history while I was in European history. And I used to call the speaker's office and say, please remind the speaker that we went to school together. And I'm pretty sure that's who he was. You can ask him to verify that. So he did not support moving the statue. He apparently owed some favors to the architect of the Capitol, who had been there for years, kind of an old curmudgeon kind of guy, who didn't want the statue moved, and claimed that it would be too hard to move it to the Rotunda to get it upstairs because it's 8 tons, and to place it near Lincoln would have been difficult because originally the Rotunda floor was open. That's why the area below it is called the Crypt. There was a plan to move, to bury George Washington and Martha Washington in the Crypt, until apparently Martha Washington put her foot down and said, absolutely not. So they're buried in Mount Vernon, and the floor was filled in, but it can't handle 8 tons of Carrara marble, apparently. In order to move it, they had to put in a new support. So it's sitting on something that will hold 8 tons. I mean, made it more reasonable to move it. But Newt Gingrich didn't want it moved. The Republican women in the House of Representatives, some of them didn't want it moved either, because they really weren't lobbying for women's equality at the time. They were more sympathetic to Phyllis Schlafly's vision of us, which is why one reason the ERA has never passed. And so we didn't have support in the House of Representatives. But we had support and a vote on it, I think. Senator Stevens arranged a vote that was unanimous to move the statue. I think I'm remembering that correctly. I'd have to check my archives. And so that's how it got started in terms of more serious support.
Mm-hmm.
And I had targeted 1995 because that was the obvious date, but we already knew that when we were making speeches at the foot of the statue in the crypt in 1990.
Mm-hmm.
So it took that much planning. It took from 1990 certainly until almost the time that we marched out on August 26th. So we started honoring August 26th with events to honor the statue from 1990 until it finally got moved.
Mm. Amazing. Anybody have any follow-up questions? Okay, so it does not get raised by 1995.
No, it did not. And we were very disappointed.
Yeah, but I just want to pause on 1995 for a moment because again, there is this video. It's just amazing, this footage, not only of you in 1990, but also 1995, which is the 75th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And you talked about this 75th anniversary steering committee, or task force, you organized these huge events in DC, including a parade, which had horses, a torch, and other symbolic elements. And I just, you and I shared some emails about this, and I just wanted you to share, and if you could read this part of your email when you talk about the logistical complexities of organizing this event on the 75th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and the details. I think that this is lost to many people. They see an event happen and they don't understand, how many logistical details it takes to execute such a thing. And so,
Right.
could you read this passage? It's should be in front of you, and then please comment on it.
Well, let me preface it by saying that I knew that a movement has to grow beyond its beginning group, and the Feminist Institute was the beginning group at the time. And as the 75th approached, about a year and a half before, it may be that by 1990, actually, I formed what was called the 75th anniversary of suffrage task force, so that more groups could join us. But for a lot of that time, in between the August 26th events every year, there was a lull where I was the only person sort of working on this, or the Feminist Institute was being active in working on the details. And so the part you want me to talk about is one of those years. It took me a full year to get the police jurisdictions alone to approve the march route. You have to go through the Capitol Hill Police, the Washington, D.C. Police jurisdiction, and the U.S. Park Police. And so it took me a year to meet with these folks and to talk about what they wanted in order to approve the march. And the Capitol Hill Police, for example, were concerned about the horses, but they were also concerned about the International Women's Year torch, which a group of the Older Women's League, or AL, wanted to run the torch lit from Alice Paul's home in New Jersey into the Capitol building for the event, for the final event for the march, and to be at the front of the march, which I thought was a good idea. But the Capitol Police objected first to the horses and horse poop, on the Capitol Hill grounds. And I wanted to distract them from that because I was going to ride my horse sort of in honor of Inez Mulholland, that there was always in the years that Alice Paul was staging marches for women to get the vote, there was always a horse at the front of the march. And so I had the pleasure of riding my horse, Razzmatazz, as the horse, who wasn't white. He was, but he was calm and just a sort of good old guy. And he was a Morgan, liver chestnut Morgan horses, which are known as calm horses. And so I was going to ride Raz. And so I said to them when they objected to the horses, I said, look, the Republicans had elephants up here last year. That's nothing. I mean, horse poop from elephants is really bad, and if you compare it to having two horses. And I wanted two horses because male horses will follow the oldest female. And I wanted a female horse with us so that I didn't have to worry, because a horse's MO is run away if they get alarmed. And so a friend's horse, Ginger, was commandeered, for the parade. And so we had Razzmatazz and Ginger at the head of the parade. So they approved that, and they gave me permission to unload the horse vans behind the Senate building, building on at the top of Capitol Hill, so we could follow the old march route of the Feminist. And so then we turned to the issue of, so I got them talking more about the torch and the problem with the torch. And there's leftover from anarchist bombings of Capitol Hill in earlier decades. There's still a law on the books that you can't light a, quote, incendiary device anywhere on Capitol Hill. And so the torch they considered an incendiary device. So the compromise, with the horse's approval behind me, the compromise on the torch was that they would have to shut the torch down when they got to Maryland Avenue and keep it off until they left DC police territory. And the Older Women's League finally agreed to that. So there were some negotiations, as I recall, and they said fine. And when you come down the march route to Pennsylvania Avenue, that ends the Capitol Hill police jurisdiction, and it starts the Washington DC police jurisdiction, which were unbending over the issue of having pooper scoopers behind the horses because they didn't want horse poop on the streets. And so we agreed that because people were going to be wearing suffrage colors, that we would try to find a group that would agree to be the horse poop group behind the horses. And they approved the march. And my memory is that we turned at 14th Street to go to the mall where we had the stage for people to make speeches, and women's organizations to set up tables and tents and that kind of thing. We had to have a Red Cross tent, not Red Cross exactly, but we had to have a medical tent on the mall. We had to have a certain number of porta toilets spaced, along both sides of the mall. And then we had to arrange for the rental of a stage and microphones and all of that. So we got past most of that, but it took a long time to get the agreements with all of these groups and to sign agreements about it. And so it was the better part of a year before I had all the agreements and realized that we could go ahead and call people to the mall. And it would be impossible now to get permission to unload horse vans behind the Senate buildings. And at the end of the events of the August 26, 1995, my committee said that they had not, the 75th Anniversary Task Force Committee said that they had not approved the porta toilets, the expense of the stage and the porta toilets. And so I was left with the $5,700 bill that my committee refused to pay for. And that certainly didn't leave. I just quietly started paying it down myself. I used to pay, I don't know, $50 for 2 years before they actually moved the statue. I used to pay like $50 a month to the stage and $50 a month to whoever it was that was the waste group that handled the porta toilets, so that I could pay that bill off rather than continue to try to lobby fruitlessly with the committee to get them paid. And when the statue was moved in 1997, I thought, Carolyn, you sap, you should ask people to pay up, and you've got to do something about this. But I never received another bill. From the moment the statue was moved, I never received another bill. They just went away. And I was spared.
Thank you for going over those details. I just think it's extremely important, and the having to deal with excrement, both of horses and human beings.
Well, and human excrement with the porta toilets, it was a huge issue for this event.
Yeah,
For-
I
for-
just,
for a large event.
we have with, I know we have shared the delight about the Scrub Women's Brigade to clean the statue, and this idea of like cleanliness and cleaning, and
Right.
that's I just wanted to highlight that because I found
By
it
the
very-
way, I didn't find the pooper scoopers until the night that I was sitting there, the night before the event. I was still on my checklist at the Sewell Belmont House because that was our headquarters at that point. I was checking off the speakers, who was speaking the next day, and when everything was supposed to arrive, and all this kind of thing. And this group of young scouts from Connecticut showed up in colonial dress. And they said, "What can we do to help?" Their leader was with them, and I said, "You could be the pooper scooper detail," and they did. And they found buckets, and we had, from my stables probably, we had buckets and large containers with handles that they could handle, and so they were dressed in costume and are walking behind the horses. If you ever see a picture of the parade,
amazing.
And those girls were wonderful. And probably in my archives, I have the name of their troop. But if any of you marched as pooper scoopers, do contact me, because I would love to give you credit, proper credit, for having done that. And we had the original banner. Some people showed up, and I didn't have anyone to carry the original banner that Alice Paul had made. And they carried the original National Woman's Party banner in the parade.
Amazing.
So,
any questions, comments about the sort of details on the organizing of the 75th anniversary of the 19th Amendment? Go ahead, Sandra.
Yes, Caroline, you have just made my day that you rode a horse down, oh my gosh, to the Capitol. I live very close to Inez Milholland's grave, so she's a very special person to me. And to hear that you like kind of reenacted that's just fantastic, how we continue to make those historic connections and realize the importance of those symbols and those traditions.
Razzmatazz, by the way, perfect parade name. I mean, he had that name long before he marched, but Razzmatazz is buried on a large farm that accepted horses, both my horses. And I got my white horse 3 years after the march, or we would have really replicated Inez Milholland's march. But Razzmatazz is buried with a marker that says, "Razzmatazz, the horse who marched for women's rights." So I haven't taken pictures of that, but I should.
Praise be to Razzmatazz.
Right. Well, and we did have an episode at the foot of the hill near the Canadian Embassy. We had not planned. We had prepared him for almost everything. Umbrellas in his face, loud noises and all of this. But the two horses got to the bottom. They were following the women that had the torch. So the torch was first, and then the horses. And so they got to the foot of the hill, and this huge steam grate exploded with steam. And I thought, oh no, they're going to make a run for it. And they stopped dead in their tracks. It stopped the march for a minute or two while the horses thought it over. And true to form, Ginger, the oldest female, stepped out, and that made Raz say, "Oh, okay, if she's going, I'm going." And then we continued with the parade. I have wonderful memories whenever I'm in a cab on Pennsylvania Avenue of that march on horseback as we came down toward 14th Street. It was just a wonderful thing. So I have good memories of standing there. We were having so much fun that Raz and I stood while a lot of marchers passed us. We just stood there quietly waving at people before I had to put him back in the horse van to go back to his stable.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I had a question for Caroline. What was the atmosphere like that day during the march? Were the spectators out? Did they know the purpose of this, or did you just have sort of people in awe standing on the side of the road like, what is going on? Why are they marching down the street?
I'm sure a lot of people, first of all, August is hot summer in Washington, D.C. So yes, we had spectators. Did we have thousands of them? I don't think so. But the marchers were from all over the United States. We had done a pretty good job of attracting women and busloads of women from different states. And so the marchers were having a wonderful time. And the banners and everything. I have not seen a video of the march. I have pictures from the march. And friends that I knew and people who knew that I'd been doing this for years were also on the sidelines clapping, as we came by and all that. And on the mall, there was a reasonable crowd. It wasn't huge. We made speeches half the afternoon. And the time for the march, which I have in my records, the time for the march was planned by the woman who taught me something about astrology. And so the march was astrologically timed for the best possible moment to walk out and to march. And it was a wonderful day for it. And so the whole thing, and I really didn't get into that with my committee. I just quietly, because I could plan when it set off, it was a wonderful day and everyone was enthusiastic and having a good time. And so the march was planned for the most visible publicity and for a day, well, August 26th was already set, but what hour is what mattered to have a really successful march.
And you can see the speeches that you're talking about. That's recorded by C-SPAN. I think it's around 3 hours long. And you can see yourself there and other individuals talking about the statue and yeah, it's really amazing footage.
Those are the speeches that, those were the speeches that were made that afternoon when the march ended.
Okay.
But the thing I haven't found yet is I don't think that I have a record. It might be on tape that someone else had taped. But we made speeches in the crypt before we went outside and I donned my riding clothes and got on a horse. We do have, my speech was not written down. I might have had an outline because by that time, I kind of knew my time was over at the time of the march. And I was practically in touch with Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It was like I knew what I was supposed to do and I was about to fulfill it. And I knew what I was going to say as I was driving toward the Capitol. And I don't think I wrote it down. So if anyone has the tape of that speech, I would love to have it. I had brought my mother and her friends, my godmothers, to Washington so they could ride in an old car that had a sign on it that said "Born Before Suffrage," because they were born in 1914 and 1915. And I wanted people to see that we have not had the vote. I mean, that 1920, we have people still alive that were, I mean, they're all dead now, but in 1995, we had a lot of women still alive who were born without the vote. This is recent history. And it's only 100 years old this year. I mean, well, in 2020, August 26, 2020. And so I wanted people to see that. And they had a marvelous time. I mean, touring Washington and all the events, because other organizations planned events that week as well. The post office issued a stamp for the occasion. And there were other events. There was an event, I think, at the Women's Museum, the Art Museum. And so we were, it was wonderful. It was to have other organizations involved as well. And so the march was part of that, but was not the only event that happened, but it was certainly the culminating event.
Anybody else? So we've been going for about 90 minutes, and I think it's a good place to stop. And I would like to, if you would do us the honor, Caroline, to come back and to talk about the actual move, which happens in 1997. We've stopped at 1995, and so I think it's a good time to stop. And so what we do at the end of every show is we just kind of go around with our final like summation. And I will ask us to do that again. And I'll start with Michael and then go to Randy and then Sandra and then Caroline, you'll have the last word. Okay, so Michael, final thoughts.
Yes, this series that we have been conducting, investigating, and coming to know, truly laying out the entire timeline and the many minute intricacies that consist the history of this portrait monument has truly been something that has left an indelible impact on myself. I had many family members, many strong women in my family who participated in the second wave of feminism in the late 60s, early 70s. My grandmother was a big proponent of it as well. And so having grown up around hearing their stories and their passion and their activism, and then coming now to learn even all the stuff that had occurred before that, laying the groundwork and the activism of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott, it's very meaningful. And I personally am very inspired by it. And it's these individuals who help to inject me with the moral energy to be able to go forth into my endeavors with heart and meaning and seeking to actualize a better world for all who inhabit it. So, and Caroline Sparks and Sandra Weber, you both constitute this history as well. So I'm most grateful and very fortunate to come to know it directly from the source, from the individuals who would be able to experience it. And it's truly a great honor. So I thank you both for coming back, and it's been a lot of fun.
I can definitely second that. In my own words, you know, when I first discovered the peace through law tradition through things in the Netherlands, and in particular the little badge associated with pro concordia labor, and I first understood the relationship between masculine and feminine, and how both are required, so to speak, in order for the ideals of peace to descend on humanity. I got interested in, I guess, sort of obsessed with this idea of integrating and pulling like both the masculine and the feminine into my personal identity. And that got woven in so tightly because there was this physical object that I would wear around, like literally on my body, right? The little pin that, you know, was this reminder that like I need to keep both energies alive and present in my daily life, or my daily actions, my daily life. And so when Hope introduced me to the statue, and you know, over the last few years I've gotten to learn more and more about it, this physical object has this unbelievable ability to share this story of ever expanding moral energy, and carry this, you know, truly transcendent pocket of human destiny into the lives of people. And I know that both Carolyn and Sandra play this amazingly crucial role in bringing that story to life for people. And so I, along with, I second what Michael said, that like gratitude is not enough to demonstrate how your work and lives have made an important improvement in my life. So thank you both for being here and for all you've done.
Thank you so much, both of you.
Yes, thank you both. I really appreciate that. And I'm honored to hear how the statue and the stories, what I put out there, um, of people appreciating it. Because sometimes as an author, you write and it just goes out there into the atmosphere, and you don't really know how it's being interpreted, how it's being used. And so to get this amazing feedback, just makes me keep going. So I really, really appreciate that. And it's been such an incredible experience for me to be here today with Caroline, and to hear her personal details, her personal experiences with these pieces of the statue, which I have to admit, I really did not study the more recent history of the statue as much as I did the prior history. And so I'm just absolutely thrilled to hear those pieces of it. And hope, I really want to praise hope here, because it's bringing us together. You're the one who is facilitating this and bringing us together to share these incredible notions, and just our different experiences that we bring to this. And it's just so valuable and so enriching. And so I really have to give you a lot of credit, Hope. Thank you.
Please don't. Please don't. Really, I'll just, it's the spirit of history. And Carolyn and I, we spoke on Friday, and you kind of said it today, Carolyn, not as clearly as you did on Friday, but there's a voice in your head, like
Yes.
there's a voice in your head, like I got to raise this thing. So,
Yes.
and that's not, is that like, what is that? And for lack of a better term, I go with John Lewis's spirit of history. And Caroline, as you tell the story of your life, you're clearly like connecting moments in your life with moments in history. The assassination of Reagan, the assassination of Viola Liuzzo. And so you're weaving this narrative of your personal life that connects with this broader narrative of the spirit of history, and working to make the world a better place, as Randy has said. And yeah, for me, I'll just put it out there. I've said this before, maybe privately to some folk, but like this work is really about the need to belong, and satisfying all of our need to belong. And I think that through this approach to history, this narrative approach that we take, and seeing this longer thread, that helps to satisfy our need to belong in a way that, like, it came up in a show maybe a couple weeks ago when we had a show about Hamza Khan, and our guest spoke about how when he heard that Jesus loves you, that this was like a turning point for him. And quite frankly, that doesn't really do it for me. Like it just like, God loves me. It doesn't satisfy my need to belong. People have said it does, and that may work for some people, but for me, it's seeing this like thread of history, and seeing it laid out there, and knowing that I could do some small thing, such as talking to both of you, Caroline and Sandra, and then also involving Randy and Michael in these stories. This is part of narrative building, and it has a psychological impact. Conversation for another day, maybe, but Caroline, you have the last word, and then we will call it a day, and I'll try to organize another dialogue for us later. Go ahead.
First of all, it haunts me that in the years that have passed, 25 years now, since the statue was, since the 75th anniversary march, um, it haunts me that I have not written this up yet, that my archives still have not been used to write the story of this. So I need help, and I need help from graduate students in history. I hope your group can join me in helping me get this done. But if not you, I would hope that some graduate student who's passionate about this would contact me to help me write this up. The other thing is that for women that gave donations to support the march, they were honoring their mothers, their aunts, their grandmothers. I have a list of all of that was damaged before we got it to the Library of Congress. The computer record was damaged. I believe it's salvageable. I need somebody who has IT skills to help me find that list and get it to the Library of Congress. So for those of you that are listening that might have participated or donated to the march, I would like to recreate all those names without, so that we have a complete list. I would appreciate your sending information to me. My email address is csparks@gwu.edu, which is my email from my 25 years as a teacher in the School of Public Health at George Washington University. If you could send me your name and that you marched with us, and who you honored, just so that when we retrieve the computer records, we can compare what you've sent me to the computer records and fill in the gaps, that would be most welcome. I'm currently the CEO of a 5-year-old company on wellness, Your Health Concierge in Chevy Chase, Maryland. We do trainings on wellness. So I have providers that are psychologists and clinical social workers that do therapy, as do I. But the Center for Wellness Training is trying to spread the word about wellness and how to heal our society through trainings for professionals, but also for the general public. And we would love to have you visit our website. It's at yourhealthconcierge.org to see what we're doing. And so I'm still actively working. And I appreciate that even when I retired from GW a couple of years ago, that I still have the capability of working. And I don't know for how much longer. I'm already 77 years old. And so I need to start working on getting these pieces of history in order while I can. So I would appreciate assistance. The move of the statue, this is my last statement here. For the move of the statue, those of us that had various disagreements over things, like the issue of paying for the stage, we all sort of declared a truce for the 3 days it took to move that statue up an elevator shaft and move it slowly across the floor of the Capitol. By that time, we had a brand new archivist at the Capitol. The old curmudgeon had retired, and he was very supportive of what we were doing. The press stayed around for the last night. I have the astrological time, by the way, of when the statue was placed. It was a wonderful time. We had a party. At that time, we could party in the Capitol. And we had a party with champagne. We had pizzas delivered to the Rotunda. And the press and those of us that had stayed who were on the 75th anniversary committee and the staff of the archivist office, the architect of the Capitol's office, had a wonderful party. And as I said, from that day on, I never received another bill. So it was a lovely time to regroup and to get to know each other again, because it had been a 2-year lag since the march. And so I do believe that we can do this, and I believe that we have to be a nation that follows wellness and that requires being able to love one another. And so, hope in some ways, I hope that you can see it that way, because I believe that's what brings people together and heals us. And that's my approach to psychology. I also want to tell you that you should say, thank you so much for that compliment, because we teach women now to take credit for what they do. So, hope I will admonish you that way.
I know, but see, in my defense, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. But in my defense, I'm gonna defer to Virginia Woolf's anti-war essay called Three Guineas,
Mhm.
where she warns women not to, quote, follow the procession of men. And that involves this whole like credit thing. And I'm of two minds about it really, and I'm really trying to, uh, just be comfortable with just knowing that I'm doing what I need to do. And what that means is I'm just like following the voice in my head. Now, should we
Yes.
give, that's it. And I'd rather give credit to other people, quite frankly. That's my view at this point in my life. But on the wellness point, thank you very much for mentioning what you're doing now. Maybe you can send us some links, or I could just put them on the show resources page for your
Oh,
health
thank you.
concierge, et cetera. We'll put it on the show resources page. But wellness, what I was trying to say, and thank you for helping me say this more clearly, and then we're going to close, that like satisfying the need to belong is part of wellness and
Yes, it
well-being.
is. Yes, it
And we have very perverse ways of satisfying the need to belong, very unhealthy ways of quote unquote, and I think satisfying one's need to belong is a way of feeling safe in the world. And some of us do that in tragically suicidal and pathological ways. And my own view is that a certain approach to history, which we call positive history, a, a, a focus on sort of positive narrative, what we call the red thread of positive history, seeing
Mhm.
this narrative laid out is really an invitation to participate, and that is, in a way, satisfying one's need to belong in a secular way. So again, for some people, it's like Jesus loves me, but I think that this connects to wellness, is what I'm trying to say. We can come and talk about that when we come back again, because we really need to talk about some more details about uh, the actual raising of the statue, which is on Mother's Day in 1997.
Yes.
Um, so we'll leave it there for now. And thank you all for being here. It really is a delight. And you've been listening to Virtues of Peace. It's kind of I have to say goodbye in this awkward way, but goodbye to everyone, and we will be back soon. Thank you. Bye bye.